Assalamu alaikum, dear listeners. How are you? I hope you're all well. We have been enjoying some good weather here in England, some nice sunshine. We've got our 10 days of summer, so we're enjoying that. I'm back with part two of my discussion on veiling and hijab. And in the last episode, I had set out a historical context where I explained the process of veiling from antiquity, from ancient history, all the way to when the Quran was revealed in the 7th century in the Hijaz, in Makkah and Medina, in that area. And one of the key things I'd mentioned in there was the link of veiling or seclusion of women to social status and the legal status, concluding that aristocratic or elite women used to practice veiling and seclusion often, and we saw that practice in many ancient societies, and that this was also linked to the legal status of women. So slave women were forbidden from veiling, whereas women who were free were allowed to veil. So we saw these key themes emerging from our analysis of ancient cultures and their social practices. I hope you found it useful. Do tell me how you thought about that episode and whether that information was new for you. If you were familiar with that information before, please do leave some comments as well, because they also inform my thinking. What I'm going to do today is start delving into the Quran, the message of the Quran, and we will start with Surah Al-Ahzab. And you will find some of the echoes of those socio-historical practices that I mentioned in the last episode. You'll find them being echoed here in these verses. So it's important to keep that context in mind. And if you can take out the time, do watch that first video, part one of this series of discussions, just to bring yourself up to speed. But I have given you a little recap as well, so you don't have to, but it'll be great if you can. What I'm going to do in this video is I will set out a little bit of detail about the Surah Al-Ahzab itself, which is the 33rd chapter of the Quran, where it is situated in the Quran. And I will be using the theory of coherence of the Quran that Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi has developed in his tafsir, Tadabbur-e-Quran. I am then going to very quickly give you an overview of the key messages in this surah, a summary of the key messages in this surah, which is really important to keep in mind. I will then delve into the specific verses which talk about the role of the Prophet's wives and certain directives that were given to them. And then also the so-called hijab verses, where the word Jilbaab is mentioned, or an outer cloak or outer covering for women. Specifically, these are verses 28 to 35, and then the second group of verses is 53 to 63. And I'm going to read out from a few translations and tafsir through this video. So I will be reading out from both English and Urdu translations and tafsir. And what I will do is I will render them, the ones that I read in Urdu, I will read in original, and then I will render them in English. So my translation won't be perfect, but it will give you the key messages from the Urdu tafsir and translation as well. I will then do a quick analysis of these verses and then conclude with what I think are the key universal messages we can glean from those verses, which can inspire us today. So this is the outline of this video and how my argument will progress today. This is a really important discussion. It is an incredibly important topic for Muslim women and men because it gives us a really good idea about, again, the moral issues at the heart of these verses and what the Quran is trying to tell us in terms of the morality that it and the moral behavior that it expects from Muslim men and women. Importantly, it tells us about what it expects from Muslim men as well when they see women in the public sphere. So these are the things that I want to tease out from these verses, because they have important implications for how Muslim men and women interact with each other and how we view each other and perceive each other, especially in the public domain. Right, so let's make a start with talking about this chapter first and how it sits within the Quran. So I have hinted before in an earlier video that the Quran has coherence. Now, there isn't really a very mature theory of coherence at the moment, and scholars have made attempts over the centuries to try to understand the structure of the Quran. Because our traditional method of understanding the Quran is by verse tafsir. It's quite broken and disparate, and I've talked about it. Fazlur Rahman uses the word atomistic, where we take one verse and try to understand it in isolation, and then we take another verse and try to understand it in isolation, and that breaks up the message of the Quran. The Quran is in fact a coherent book, and one of the most mature theories so far has been given by Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi. And he groups all of the chapters of the Quran. There are 114 chapters in the Quran. He groups them into 7 major groups, Abab. And Surah Al-Ahzab sits within the 4th one. Let me just very quickly give you some key details about this chapter and what it covers. So this particular section of the Quran, this particular group, starts from Surah Al-Furqan, which is the 25th surah of the Quran, and it finishes at Surah Al-Ahzab, which is the 33rd surah of the Quran. All of the first surahs or chapters were revealed in Makkah, and this last one in this group was revealed in Medina, and it was revealed around the 5th century after the Hijrah, when the Prophet migrated from Makkah to Medina. So at that time, the Muslim community is becoming established, and it was engaged in quite prolonged battle with forces that had gathered around them, and a group of tribes from the Quraysh had formed an alliance to try to defeat Muslims. And you would have heard of the Battle of the Trench, or Ghazwa Khandaq as we call it, where Muslims had dug a trench around Medina, which the opposing forces could not cross, and eventually they gave up the siege and left. And Ahzab then therefore is about the Battle of the Trench, okay, or the joined up forces. That's what the chapter heading means, the joined up forces. So this is around the 5th Hijrah, or the 5th year after the migration from Makkah, that this surah is revealed. Now the main themes of this surah cover the station of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam amongst all prophets, his relationship with the wider Muslim community and his authority in the wider Muslim community, the status of the Prophet's wives within that community, and the special status, the special relationship that was established between them and all other believers. They were given the status of Ummahatul Mu'mineen in this particular chapter of the Quran, the mothers of the believers. You find this in the 6th verse number 6 of this chapter. The surah also talks about the great responsibility that Allah has placed on us as human beings, and to explain that responsibility and what it entails from us, he sent us this guidance in the Quran and this explanation in the Quran. As I've mentioned, the surah was revealed in the 5th century, in the 5th year after the Hijrah. And this was a time when hypocrites, and these are people who were on one hand pretending to be allies of Muslims, but then on the other hand, they were conspiring against Muslims. And they were working together to slander the Muslim community and create pressure on them. And one of the ways of creating pressure was to say quite awful things about the Prophet's wives, about their character. And it is at this difficult time that the Prophet's wives were given the choice as to whether they wanted to remain with him as his wives or whether they wanted to leave him. If they stayed with him, they were then given responsibility to act as the Ummahatul Mu'mineen, or the mothers of the believers, and the reward and punishment would be twice that of ordinary believers. So the very specific set of verses here about the station of the Prophet's wives. And after this, Prophet Muhammad was also told that he could not marry additional women. His wives were also told that they could not remarry. And so with this background in mind, we can then try to understand the first group of verses that I mentioned, which is from 28 to 35, where the verses start from specifically addressing the Prophet and his wives, and then move on to a more general message. So I'm going to read those out so you can see how clear the Quran is in this matter. This is verse 28, and I'm reading from Abdul Halim's translation of the Quran. Prophet, say to your wives, if your desire is for the present life and its finery, then come, I will make provision for you and release you with kindness. So in this verse, Allah is basically setting out a choice for the Prophet's wives, and saying to the Prophet that he can release them with kindness or divorce them with kindness if they choose not to stay with him. I'll continue. But if you desire God, his messenger, and the final home, then remember that God has prepared great rewards for those of you who do good. Wives of the Prophet, if any of you does something clearly outrageous, she will be doubly punished that is easy for God. But if any of you is obedient to God and his messenger and does good deeds, know that we shall give her a double reward and have prepared a generous provision for her. I'll pause here for a second and just ask you to reflect on this verse, which is setting out a different equation for reward and punishment for the Prophet's wives. Because they have that higher level of responsibility, they also have this high level of accountability. And so the punishment would be doubled and the reward would be doubled depending on their deeds. Wives of the Prophet, you're not like any other woman. Again, I'll just pause here for a second. The Quran is telling us directly that this is an exception. This is not a general rule. Whatever we read next is going to be an exception which pertains to the Prophet's wives. So it's a very specific set of verses. Wives of the Prophet, you are not like any other woman. If you are truly mindful of God, do not speak too softly in case the sick at heart should lust after you, but speak in an appropriate manner. Stay at home and do not flaunt your finery as they used to in the pagan past. Keep up the prayer, give the prescribed alms, and obey God and his messenger. God wishes to keep uncleanness away from you, people of the Prophet's house, and to purify you thoroughly. Remember what is recited in your houses of God's revelations and wisdom, for God is all subtle, all aware. And then in the last verse in this group, which is verse 35, there is a general message. And this is an important message because it establishes spiritual equality between men and women. For men and women who are devoted to God, believing men and women, obedient men and women, truthful men and women, steadfast men and women, humble men and women, charitable men and women, fasting men and women, chaste men and women who remember God often. God has prepared forgiveness and a rich reward. So this is the first set of verses in Surah Al-Ahzab where Allah has given a particular code of conduct to the Prophet's wives. And you can see that it's quite a strict code of conduct. They're not allowed to go out of the house. They are asked to seclude. They are asked to not speak softly, otherwise men would lust after them. And because they're being given that status of the mother of the believers, this idea of seclusion and segregation makes perfect sense, because you don't want the Prophet's wives to be seen very often in the public domain. We know that they're already at risk of slander. And so so Allah is deliberately introducing those barriers, those protections and safeguards to make sure that the Prophet's wives are protected. And of course, by doing that, the Prophet is also protected, because it must be of incredible pain for him to see his wives go through something like that, to be treated badly by the hypocrites of Medina. The Prophet's wives are also told not to flaunt their finery as they used to in the pagan past. Again, this is important to keep in mind, that even free women, aristocratic women who came from what was seen as good families, not slave women, even they used to flaunt their finery and their adornments out in public. And this was to flaunt their wealth and status. And we will again find an echo of that when we read Surah Nur verses, inshallah, next time when we do the exegesis of Surah Nur, where this flaunting of adornments, a flaunting of finery is mentioned again. So it was very much a prevalent practice in the pagan past. And the Prophet's wives are being told not to do that, but to actually remain very humble and not flaunt themselves in any way. And then, of course, there is the directive around prayer and paying charity and obeying God and his messenger. So this is the first group of verses. You will find that there is no mention of the Jilbaab or outer cloak or anything like that in this set of verses. The reason why I've read them is often scholars, and I've seen that conservative scholars do this a lot, is that they take these rules which are meant for the wives of the Prophet and they generalize them for all Muslim women. And so you will often hear around you things like, oh, a woman should not laugh very loudly, or a woman should not speak softly or in soft tones to other men. Or that their voice should not be heard outside the four walls of a house. And all of these, cultural and religious ideas, these cultures and religious codes of conduct which are imposed on Muslim women. And it is then argued that if you speak politely to a man, or if you speak softly to a man, or if you even smile at him, which might even just be a cultural practice, smiling at somebody or saying hello or good morning might just be a cultural practice, even that is seen as forbidden and sinful, which then means that the behavior of Muslim women becomes highly regulated and very, very strict, and they're told to behave in a very austere, in a very harsh manner. Now, normally, human beings don't interact in austere and harsh manner. We tend to interact with each other in a very nice, in a very pleasant manner. But unfortunately, because this level of strictness has been introduced, even normal behavior is construed as flirtatious behavior. And then women, it is almost always women whose behavior is regulated, and they carry a lot of social anxiety with them. I'm sure many of you, if you've grown up in cultures like I have in Pakistan, where women's conduct is judged all the time, you do have a lot of social anxiety, and you kind of hold your shoulders up like that, and you're always worried about who's watching you and who's judging you and who's reading you. And if you sat next to your class fellow, and if you laugh loudly, are you now going to be judged as somebody who's being inappropriate? But if you read the Qur'an, you will see that these particular directives about how to speak to men and how to conduct yourself and to seclude and to veil pertained to the wives of the Prophet, because they had a particular station, a particular relationship with their community, which was that of mothers of the believers. And so any sexual inappropriateness, any chances of any flirtatious or inappropriate behavior to occur, those were removed from the equation altogether, because Allah put these additional safeguards in place for them. And He gave the choice to the Prophet's wives, telling them that there will be this strictness in your lives. Do you want to live with the Prophet as his wives or not? And if you don't, you have the choice not to, and you're not going to be judged for that. So it's a very specific set of verses pertaining to the Prophet's wives, and they should not be generalized. So if you come across generalizations like that, please do question them and do critique them. Don't just accept them as the Quran's directive for Muslim women in general. Right, let's move on then to the next set of verses. And these are the ones where the directive for seclusion and veiling is taken out for most Muslim women, and a dress code is prescribed for them by many conservative ulama and scholars. But let's have a read of these verses, and I'll start from verse 53 simply because it sets out the background for us very nicely. Let me just bring those up. Right, again I'm reading from Abdul Halim, and I will compare some of the translations of these verses as well, so you have a variety of viewpoints in front of you. Believers, do not enter the Prophet's apartments for a meal unless you are given permission to do so. Do not linger until a meal is ready. When you are invited, go in. Then when you have taken your meal, leave. Do not stay on and talk, for that would offend the Prophet, though he would shrink from asking you to leave. God does not shrink from the truth. When you ask his wives for something, do so from behind a screen. This is purer both for your hearts and for theirs. Now here is another rule for the Prophet's wives, that when they are spoken to, that people should speak to them from behind a screen. It is not right for you to offend God's messenger, just as you should never marry his wives after him. That would be grievous in God's eyes. Here is a further rule, that no one was allowed to marry the Prophet's wives after he passed away. God has full knowledge of all things, whether you reveal them or not. The Prophet's wives are not to blame if they are seen by their fathers, their sons, their brothers' sons, their sisters' sons, their women, or their slaves. Wives of the Prophet, be mindful of God. God observes everything. God and his angels bless the Prophet, so you who believe, bless him too and give him greetings of peace. Those who insult God and his messenger will be rejected by God in this world and the next. He has prepared a humiliating torment for them. And those who undeservedly insult believing men and women will bear the guilt of slander and flagrant sin. Prophet, tell your wives, your daughters, and women believers to make their outer garments hang low over them. This will make it more likely that they will be recognized and not insulted. God is most forgiving, most merciful. Now this is verse 59, where this specific directive comes in, where the Prophet is asked to tell his wives, his daughters, and women believers to make their outer garments, their jilbaab, hang low over them. And we'll look into what this means, hang low over them. If the hypocrites, the sick at heart, and those who spread lies in the city do not desist, we shall rouse you, Prophet, against them and then they will only be neighbors in this city for a short while. They will be rejected. Wherever they are found, they will be arrested and put to death. This has been God's practice with those who went before. You will find no change in God's practices. So if these hypocrites do not stop their behavior, then the Prophet is being authorized to persecute them and to exile them from the city, to expel them from the city. And if they get arrested, they will be put to death. So this will come under what the Quran calls fasad fil ard, which is spreading chaos and mischief in the land, or in other words, creating so much havoc and so much chaos that it damages the fabric of society. And the Quran allows the death penalty for fasad fil ard, or spreading chaos like that. And the Prophet is being given the authority here to persecute these people and to either expel them from the city, or if they are arrested, then that they're to be put to death. So you can see how serious this issue is at that time for the Muslim community. Now I'm going to quickly return to the Jilbaab and women believers and the Prophet's wives and daughters being told to make their outer garments hang low over them. And Abdul Halim puts a small footnote here. He says the Arabic idiom adna al-jilbab means make it hang low, not wrap around, as other translators have assumed. Now that's a good point that he makes. You'll see that both Maulana Maududi and Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi also make this point, that it means to make it hang low over you. And what they're saying in effect is that the outer cloak should be covering a woman from head to toe almost, and then wrapped around her as well, okay? And that will distinguish her from other women, particularly then when we see this in the context of slavery, from slave women who were actually not allowed to veil. So it was social custom that they could not wear a veil, right? So you can see immediately that Muslim women will become distinct and become recognizable. And this seems to be the core bit of this particular ruling. Let's now look at the same verses as they have been explained by Muhammad Asad in his tafsir. I have Muhammad Asad's exegesis here, his tafsir, called the Message of the Quran. If you Google it and search for the PDF, you'll be able to find the full document. I will now read the same verse, which is verse 59 of Surah Al-Ahzab. I'll read the translation first and then the footnote to the translation is footnote 75. Muhammad Asad writes, O Prophet, tell thy wives and thy daughters, as well as all other believing women, that they should draw over themselves some of their outer garments when in public. This will be more conducive to their being recognized as decent women and not annoyed. But withal, God is indeed much forgiving, a dispenser of grace. And then in footnote 75, to this chapter, this verse, he writes, the specific time-bound formulation of the above verse, evident in the reference to the wives and daughters of the Prophet, as well as the deliberate vagueness of the recommendation that women should draw upon themselves some of their outer garments, min jalabi bihinna, when in public, makes it clear that this verse was not meant to be an injunction or hukum in the general, timeless sense of this term, but rather a moral guideline to be observed against the ever-changing background of time and social environment. This finding is reinforced by the concluding reference to God's forgiveness and grace. This is Muhammad Asad's view of this particular verse, and you can see here that he considers it specific and time-bound. In other words, there was a crisis in Medina and the Prophet's household were being slandered by these hypocrites who were basically arguing, if you look into the tradition around this verse, the riwayat that we find in hadith, that we find in the seerah literature, the biography of the Prophet, which pertains to the circumstances in which the Quran is being revealed and the historical events that were taking place. We find that the hypocrites used to wait outside the Prophet's house and the Muslim community, the village in which Muslims lived, and they would wait outside. And when Muslim women used to come out to relieve themselves, because of course nobody had indoor plumbing at that time, if you needed to go to the toilet, you went outside. Still the case in many countries, actually in India, still very much a big problem. Anyway, so women would come out late at night. So often if you see this practice, because women like to be private and they tend to go outside in a group, because it's safer to go outside in a group, and they tend to do that when it's not light and bright outside. So there are usually two times, and these are the two times mentioned as well in the riwayat or the traditions, is one just around just before the sun comes up. So it's just starting to get light outside, but it's still quite dark. And secondly, at dusk. So just around sunset time. And in those two times, women used to go out to relieve themselves, to go to the toilet. And the hypocrites would then slander them, would say quite awful things about them, would sexually harass them. And when they were asked about it and told to desist, they would say, well, we did not know that these are Muslim women, because how could we distinguish them from non-Muslim women? And they would say that they were actually slaves. And slaves, of course, because they did not have those rights, and slaves were seen as promiscuous, sexualized individuals, they would treat them as they would treat slaves and say, well, how do we know that they're not slaves? We're just treating them like we would treat slaves. So what is wrong with that? So they were using that as an excuse. And what Muhammad Asad is doing is pointing to that historical circumstance and saying that this verse was was a safeguard brought in by Allah to protect women, and to take away any excuse that those hypocrites had. Well, because their excuse was, oh, we get confused. We don't know if these are free women or slave women, if they're believing women or non-believing women. And to take that excuse away, Muslim women were told to dress in a particular way so they would become distinguished and recognizable and become visible. And then the excuse that those men of the Jahiliyyah, and Asma Barlas uses the term Jahili men for them, which I think is a very appropriate term, that took the excuse away from the Jahili men to mistreat Muslim women. And so Muhammad Asad explains this particular verse not as a general rule for all Muslim women of all times, but as a time-bound rule that was given to the Prophet to be explained to his wives, to his daughters, and other Muslim women of that community. So he sees that as specific. Asma Barlas also sees that as specific, but I'll come to her words later on, because actually she gives us some really key insights into the meaning of these verses, and particularly the visibility, the principle of visibility here in these verses. So, and it's interesting that often Muslim women are told to cover themselves and almost become invisible in the public sphere, not to show their face, not to wear distinctive clothes, or to have that individual, their sense of individual self and personality. Whereas these verses are actually making Muslim women more visible rather than less visible, because of how they stand out, because of how they dress. So I'll come back to Asma Barlas in a moment, but I do want to very quickly look at two other viewpoints which are different from Muhammad Asad's, and both of these come from great scholars of the Indian subcontinent, Maulana Maududi and Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi. So I'll read from Maulana Maududi first. Right? So I'll just bring up his translation in tafsir. Just bear with me a moment. So I have Maulana Maududi's tafsir, Tafhim al-Qur'an open in front of me. Again, you can Google it and find it online on archive.org. And I'm going to read the same verse, which is verse 59, and his explanation as well. I will read it in Urdu first, and then I'll just render it into English. And this isn't a technical rendition. I'm just going to just read it out in English as well as I'm translating it. So he says, this is verse 59. ए नबी सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम, अपनी बीवियों और बेटियों और अहले ईमान की औरतों से कह दो कि अपने ऊपर अपनी चादर के पल्लू लटका लिया करें। ये ज़्यादा मुनासिब तरीका है ताकि वो पहचान ली जाएं और ना सताई जाएं। अल्लाह ताला गफूर और रहीम है। So let me just read out the Urdu tafsir as well, and then I'll render the whole thing into English. This is footnote 1110. असल अल्फाज हैं युदनीना अलैहिन्ना मिन जलाबी बिहिन्ना। जिलबाब अरबी ज़बान में बड़ी चादर को कहते हैं, और अदना के मानी असल करीब करने और लपेट लेने के हैं, मगर जब इसके साथ अला का सिला आ जाए तो इसमें इरखा यानी ऊपर से लटका लेने का मफ़हूम पैदा हो जाता है। मौजूदा ज़माने के बाज़ मुतरजमीन मुफस्सिरीन मगरिबी मजाक से मग़लूब होकर इस लफ्ज़ का तर्जुमा सिर्फ लपेट लेना करते हैं ताकि किसी तरह चेहरा छुपाने के हुक्म से बच निकला जाए। अब मैं इसको इंग्लिश में भी ट्रांसलेट करती हूँ। लेट मी ट्रांसलेट दिस इन इंग्लिश। O Prophet, tell your wives and your daughters and the believing women that they should take their shawls, their jilbaab, and hang it over them. He then says in footnote 110 that jilbab is a word, Arabic word referring to a very big shawl or a big shawl. And the meaning here is to bring it close to you and to cover yourself with it. But when the preposition ala is used, then it means that you must bring it on top of you. In other words, hang it over you, which is quite similar to how Abdul Halim translated it earlier on. But interestingly then, Maulana Maududi goes on to particularly mention that there are some translators and exegeses of the Qur'an who are very impressed with the West, and they tend to only mention wrapping around yourself. So in his view, in Maulana Maududi's view, if you use the jilbab, if you translate the word jilbab as a wrap or a shawl, and not as a wrap or a shawl that must cover you from the top, then you are in effect very impressed by the West. And this, of course, gives us an insight into Maulana Maududi's political views. And we know that in his political views, he very much used to critique the West and wanted to distinguish Islam from the West. So you can see some of that politics coming in here. But then the reason he gives is the reason why people translate it just as wrapping around and not bringing it over yourselves is that they want to get away from the hukum, from the rule, and this is what he's saying, from the hukum of covering of the face. In other words, if somebody translates this as just wrap your cloak around yourself and not over yourself or hang it over yourself, then it means that that person is impressed by the West and just wants to get away from the idea that women should cover their faces. Now, the reason why Maulana Maududi is saying that is that he was always pro-Parda. He has actually written a book called Parda, and it's an extensive discussion. You can read it. Again, it's easily available online, where he makes the case that women should be excluded and women should cover their faces. So you can see those views now entering his exegesis, his explanation of this particular verse. And he thinks that he attaches importance to how it is worn over you, hung over you. And then he gives us some further, in the same footnote, he cites some further traditions where he says, for instance, that the cloak should cover a woman's face and only one eye should be visible. She should cover her face with it. And then this is, or that they can only keep their eyes visible, but everything else should be covered. But quite interestingly, he also brings to us the tafsir that Imam Tabari has written. And you know, Tabari is one of the earliest mufassirin or exegetes of the Quran. And Tabari actually says in his tafsir, in Jama al-Bayan, that it is sharif. The word Maulana Maududi uses here is sharif. Okay, so women who come from decent, free, aristocratic or elite households, that women who are sharif, that they do not wear the clothes that slave women and concubines wear. And so their hair and their faces should not be open like they are, like the practice of slave women. And they should take their jilbaab and cover themselves with the jilbaab. Interestingly then, it's Tabari who is making a reference to slave women. But Maulana Maududi does not make further reference to slave women later on. He says that this is a general hukum for all Muslim women that they should cover their faces. And he does not contextualize it in the social situation, which is that slavery existed at that time. And there were social practices of veiling, and those social practices had to do with social and legal status of women. And those legal statuses were different for slave women and free women. But Tabari does mention it, and Maulana Maududi brings that reference. Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi actually gives very similar reasoning. He also thinks that women should cover their faces. He also thinks that this is a general hukum that is still applicable to Muslim women. And the argument he uses is that society now is just as corrupt as society used to be before. And so the reason why this ruling was put into place was because of that moral corruption. And because that moral corruption exists, women should continue to veil themselves and cover their faces. This is Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi's argument. So now you've seen that there's a tension. There's a tension here amongst scholars, some of whom think that this is a specific ruling, and others who think this is a general ruling that applies to all situations and all times. Another person whose viewpoint is quite important here is Javed Ahmed Ghamidis, who, as you know, is a reformist scholar of our times, a great scholar of our times, and he's actually Maulana Islahi's student. But when he writes his tafsir, he actually does not take the view that Maulana Islahi has done. He says that based on the text of the Quran and based on the context of these verses. So when I read out the full paragraphs, you could see that these verses have a particular context. There's a narrative, there's a situation that the Quran is addressing. And Javed Ahmed Ghamidi puts emphasis on that, and he says that the text of the verses and the context of the verses, both internal and external context of the verses, tell us that this was a specific time-bound ruling to protect Muslim women from the mischief and slander which was being directed towards them by the hypocrites of Medina. So again, he sees that as a specific ruling, even though his own teacher saw that as a general ruling. And you'll keep coming across these tensions as you read different scholars. But what I find in general is that if a scholar is already pro-parda, if he already believes that women should be veiled and secluded, then they would translate the verse as Maulana Maududi has done. If they don't believe in that, then they're not going to translate the verse in that way. And they will probably take the view that Muhammad Asad and Javed Ahmed Ghamidi have taken. Now, what do I think about all of this after having read all of this and other discussions on this matter? My view is that these verses are specific and they were addressing a particular situation, that they are not general. And the reason for this ruling is not the moral corruption that was in society, but to protect Muslim women from slander that was being directed towards them. And I think that Barlas's view is really important here, because she sees that as a way of making Muslim women look more distinguished and more visible rather than less visible. Whereas these days, when women are told to seclude or to veil, they're actually being made invisible. They're not meant to have their presence or unique presence in the public domain, and they're taken out of the public domain. Whereas here, in the public domain, Muslim women are being made more visible. And so the underlying reason, the rationale for the ruling is different from how Maulana Maududi and Maulana Amin Hassan Islahi have understood it. So let me just quickly read out Asma Barlas at this point, because there are a couple of really interesting things she says which are food for thought for us and which give us an insight into the behavior of Jahili men. So Asma Barlas basically puts the Surah Al-Ahzab verses and Surah Al-Nur verses together on one page, and she is doing a little bit of comparison which she builds on in chapter 6, but I'm reading from an earlier chapter at the moment, and I will try to focus only on Surah Al-Ahzab. But if you see me making a comparison, that comparison is with Surah Al-Nur verses, which inshallah we'll pick up later on. This is page 58 and 59 that I'm reading from Asma Barlas's book, Believing Women in Islam. And she tells us also about how you see increasing strictness in discussions around Muslim women's dress code. Conservatives read these ayat as giving Muslim men the right to force women to don everything from the hijab, which is a head veil that leaves the face uncovered, to the burqa, a head-to-toe shroud that hides even the feet. Some models even mandate wearing gloves so as to hide the hands. They justify such forms of veiling on the grounds that Muslim women's bodies are pudendal, hence sexually corrupting to those who see them. Now, the word pudendal actually means that that women's bodies are sexual, and all of their bodies are sexual, like the genitalia are sexual. All of a woman's body is sexual. It is thus necessary to shield Muslim men from viewing Muslim women's bodies by concealing them. This claim draws on classical exegesis, in which such a view of women's bodies developed only gradually, whereas Al-Tabari, who died in the 10th century, about 400 years after the Prophet's passing away, whereas Al-Tabari held that both women and men could show those parts of the body that were not pudendal. Al-Baydawi, who died in the 13th century, so he's roughly 400 years after Tabari, ruled that the entire body of a free woman was pudendal, the gaze itself being a messenger of fornication. Now this is interesting, that over this period of about 4 centuries, how views change and become more strict. And whereas Tabari is taking a more lenient view, Al-Baydawi is then arguing that the entire body of a free woman was pudendal. This is important. Why does he mention free women? Because slave women were already seen as available for men, and free women were not. And because free women were not, their entire bodies were then considered sexual, and so they had to be hidden. By the 17th century, Al-Khafafi had decreed even face and hands pudendal. So by the time we reach the 17th century, it's about roughly 1,000 years after the Prophet's passing away, Al-Khafafi is writing and saying that even face and hands can be sexualizing, even face and hands become the aura. And so this is where the view comes from, that all of a woman is aura. When the word aura is actually quite a demeaning word. It's not a word I like, because it basically means that all of a woman is a sexual being, that all of a woman is a sexual organ almost, that her hands, her face, her voice, everything, her hair, everything is sexual. And you can see that view is actually newish. It only emerges in the 17th century, but it reaches us now almost as given truth. This is what you hear around you all the time, that all of a woman is aura. Further down the page, Barlas writes, to begin with, the Qur'an uses the words Jilbaab, cloak, and khumur, shawl, both of which in ordinary usage cover the bosom or the jiyub and neck, not the face, head, hands, or feet. The Qur'an does not mandate such a form of veiling in any ayat. Women prayed unveiled in mosques until the 3rd century of Islam, and they performed the Hajj, the holiest ritual in Islam, with faces uncovered. Even more significantly, the purposes of the covering in these two sets of ayat are different. Here she's referring to Surah Al-Ahzab and Surah Al-Nur. In the first set, which is Al-Ahzab, the Jilbaab is meant not to hide free Muslim women from Muslim men, but to render them visible, hence recognizable by Jahili men as a way to protect the women. This form of recognition and protection took its meaning from the social structure of a slave-owning society in which sexual abuse, especially of slaves, was rampant. While odious, such practices were not specific to the Arabs, nor were they aberrant. As some feminists have noted, in ancient societies, women in the public arena were considered to be prostitutes. In such societies, therefore, the law of the veil distinguished which women were under male protection and which were fair game. In mandating the Jilbaab, then, the Quran explicitly connects it to a slave-owning society in which sexual abuse by non-Muslim men was normative, and its purpose was to distinguish free, believing women from slaves who were presumed by Jahili men to be non-believers and thus fair game. Therefore, only in a slave-owning Jahili society does the Jilbaab signify sexual non-availability, and only if Jahili men were willing to invest it with such a meaning. Consequently, even though worn by Muslim women, the Jilbaab served as a marker of Jahili male sexual promiscuity and abuse at a time when women had no legal recourse against such abuse and had to rely on themselves for their own protection. Now this, I think, is a brilliant analysis. Well, it comes from a Muslim woman who's reading these verses, and as I've said before, Muslim women are just as entitled to interpret the Quran and draw meaning from it as Muslim men. And what she's drawing attention to here is this idea of visibility and the behavior of Jahili men. Now the Jahili men, these are men who slander and abuse women who are out in the public domain, because they believe that any woman who's out in the public domain is fair game. Now, unfortunately, and I say this with a heavy heart, but I know, and I've seen a lot of Muslim men growing up in Pakistan as well, where they feel that if a woman steps outside to go to work, to study, or to just be outside, to go to a park, to go shopping, to catch a bus, that they are fair game, and they behave like Jahili men. And let me just point out that the Quran in verse 60, which literally follows verse 59, in the very next verse, the Quran says that they are the accursed, that Allah has cursed them. The Arabic word for them is mal'oonin. And so men who behave like Jahili men are mal'oonin, or cursed by God. And it is such a strong condemnation of that behavior, of treating women in such a sexualized and objectified way, is that God will not forgive that behavior and he will curse those men. The other thing Barlas is pointing out here, apart from this behavior of Jahili men or this Jahili behavior, is that she's talking about the principle of visibility, that in that time, in a slave-owning society where slaves were not allowed to veil, women who were allowed to veil, the veil signified that they had the protection of their tribe and the community and the men behind them. And so if somebody was going to slander a woman who was veiled, then he would also expect retribution. In other words, action would be taken against the slanderer and he'd be persecuted. And so the veil signified the protection of men. And it is only in that society that this ruling of the jilbab then makes sense. Because nowadays we don't live in slave owning societies. We don't have different rules of dress or dress code for free women and slave women. What we have now are different sets of dress code for women who are considered to be decent and modest and women who sexualize themselves. And that varies from culture to culture. And Muslim women themselves know, and non-Muslim women also know, what is sexualizing dress and what is not a sexualizing dress. And of course, in Surah Al-Nur, then, there are some further guidelines given about the definition of modesty that Allah gives us. So there is a broad definition of modesty that we can work to, and inshallah, we'll build on that later on. But women themselves know, and men themselves know, what is sexualizing or non-sexualizing dress code. Even for men, what is sexualizing dress code. However, to say that the ruling of the jilbab was for all times and for all societies no longer makes sense, because we no longer live in slave-owning societies. And if I would argue that Muslim women are living in Muslim societies, then they should actually not have to face this horrible, traumatic behavior, which Asma Barlas calls Jahili behavior, or the behavior of Jahili men. Why would Muslim women need to distinguish themselves or hide themselves behind a burqa or a niqab or a shuttlecock burqa or any of those forms of veiling and seclusion which are meant to hide the identity of women and to make them invisible in the public sphere? Why should they need to do that if they are in a Muslim society? Because the question is, why would Muslim men behave like Jahili men in the first place? Women should actually feel protected and secure in those societies. Can we draw anything general from this set of verses? Yes, we can. One of the general guidelines we can draw from that is that Muslim women should be aware of what is sexualizing dress code or indecent dress code in their society, in their culture, and they should refrain from practicing that. So they should dress in a dignified and modest manner. And of course, definitions of modesty would vary depending on culture. The other important thing is that it is a moment of reflection and pause for men in terms of drawing out general guidance, and I do want to emphasize this here, that Muslim men should be respectful towards Muslim women, regardless of what they're wearing, regardless of whether they're related to them or not related to them, regardless of whether they're choosing to step outside the house to go and study and work or become a political leader or a doctor or an engineer or be in a workplace or anything like that. Because women have the right to do those things. If women are harassed or if judgments are made about their character based on what they wear, and if women are then harassed, slandered, catcalled, wolf whistled, or some awful word thrown at them, which can be a common experience in certain cultures, then those men need to take a pause and think about how Allah thinks of that behavior. It's a behavior that he strongly condemns. And so Muslim men should take care that they are never seen as the hypocrites of Medina or the Malounin or the cursed ones who were treating women in those sexualized ways or objectifying them or sexually harassing them. And I think these are the two things that we can take away in terms of our understanding of these verses. What we cannot take away is any mandatory hukum or any mandatory legal injunction about Muslim women's dress code, or even we can't even conclude that Muslim men or religious scholars or heads of household or men in charge, men who have more influence, authority, that they can tell women what to wear, making the argument that that's going to protect them. We know for a fact that that's not going to protect them. We know that rape and sexual assault happens regardless of how a woman is dressed, because they're always crimes of power. They're always crimes where men think that they have the authority, they have the right to abuse. And so making the case that dressing differently is going to protect women no longer is tenable. It was tenable at that time when we knew that dress code signified social status, but it's not tenable now. And these are the key reflections, I think, after reading the Quran in this depth, these verses in this depth, we can understand what Allah is trying to institute at that time to protect the Muslim community from people who are abusers, who are slanderers, who are the enemies of Islam. But that those conditions no longer hold, and therefore we cannot generalize from those conditions any dress code for Muslim women. And we should not then use a Muslim woman's dress to judge her or to give her some kind of status, decent or indecent, or sexualized or not, or secluded or not. If she stepped outside of the house, then she's fair game. Those assumptions are very wrong, and those assumptions are actually, and that behavior is condemned by the Quran. So this is the exegesis, the explanation of the verse of Surah Al-Ahzab, and the link to veiling and the Jilbaab. I hope that you have found this very in-depth discussion useful and informative. Please do share your comments, your questions in the comment section to this video. Please do subscribe to this channel as well. We will inshallah have more discussion on Surah Al-Nur next time, where we do find some general rulings for men and women. And I'll give you a number of interpretations from that, and just like as I've done today, my own personal conclusions from those interpretations as well. So I hope you found this beneficial. Please do subscribe to my channel, my work. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.